In this talk, we're going to take a journey within and investigate the nature of consciousness by simply being mindful of its arising and passing and recognizing that it's transitory and not self. We're going to unravel this mystery called consciousness as defined by the Buddha as the fifth aggregate that arises from the interplay of the six senses and their corresponding objects. Get ready to dive into the depths of being and unlock new insights about the nature of consciousness. Consciousness, or vinnana in Pali, is the fifth aggregate and refers to the consciousness that arises through the six sense organs: eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind, and their corresponding sense objects: visible form, sound, smells, taste, physical sensations, and mental phenomenon. Sense consciousness arises when the sense organ comes into contact with their corresponding objects, and it is said to be conditioned by the physical body. It is knowing or being conscious of a sensory stimulus or a thought. We can investigate consciousness by sustaining mindfulness of the arising of objects and seeing that which is aware or conscious. We see that sense consciousness is transitory and only arises in conjunction with a sense object. This way we directly see that consciousness is not self. Joseph Goldstein talks about reframing our experience in a passive voice. He instructs us to take the I out of the description. So say a sound is being known or a thought is being known, rather than I hear a sound or I had a thought. We can investigate consciousness in many ways by sustaining mindfulness of the arising of objects and seeing that which is aware. I had some insight into this aggregate quite early on doing a walking meditation. I noticed that whenever I took a step, it was accompanied by a moment of awareness, a kind of burst of consciousness that arose in tandem with the physical sensations of walking. What was even more intriguing was the realization that this consciousness arose simultaneously with the physical sensation without any effort or control on my part. And this was really my first glimpse into the true nature of consciousness and the self, where I saw that there's no one behind the wheel driving the process. For me, this was, as I said, the first taste or insight into no self. As I continued my meditation journey, my mindfulness became more acute, and I saw not only the fleeting nature of physical sensations, but also the ephemeral quality of awareness itself. I noticed that the objects of my experience arose and passed away like clouds in the sky, but so did also the knowing facility also arose and passed away. Here's a fictional story that might also illuminate the true nature of consciousness. Dr. John was a professor known for his expertise in the field of consciousness studies. And one day a student came to him with a question about the nature of consciousness. He asked, is consciousness in the mind or in the brain? Dr. John replied, the answer is neither. Consciousness arises in dependence on objects, both external and internal. Just as a fire cannot exist without fuel, so too consciousness cannot exist without objects to be aware of. The student was somewhat confused. So Dr. John decided to give him a demonstration. He took the student to a laboratory where they conducted an experiment. They placed a rat in a cage and monitored its brain activity while it kind of explored the surroundings. As the rat encountered various objects, the brain activity increased, and they could measure this. And Dr. John explained, this is how consciousness arises. It is the result of the interaction with sense objects. The student was amazed and asked, "But what happens when the objects are no longer present?" Dr. John replied, "Just as the fire goes out when the fuel is exhausted, so too consciousness goes out when the objects are no longer present." Consciousness is not a permanent entity, but rather an impermanent phenomenon that arises and ceases dependent on objects. So consciousness is contingent. Sense consciousness arises dependent upon a sense object and a sense organ. It is the knowing element of the mind. Both the I and the visible object are the physical elements, but they're not enough to produce a human experience by themselves. Only the co-presence of consciousness together with the I and the visible object produces a human experience. And this is the same with ear, nose, tongue, body. It's all the same. Consciousness is therefore an indispensable element in us having an experience, but it still needs the object and the sense organ. The Buddha explained the contingent nature of consciousness in response to a monk named Sati, who believed that there was a consciousness that was permanent. The Buddha responded by saying, "What is that consciousness?" "Venerable Sir, it is that which speaks and feels and experiences here and there the result of good and bad actions." "Misguided man," said the Buddha, "to whom have you ever known me to teach the Dharma in that way?" "Misguided man, in many discourses I have not stated consciousness to be dependently arisen, since without condition there is no origination of consciousness." End of quote from the Buddha. So sense consciousness is not always just present, waiting for some object to be known. Rather, it's a process that's continually arising and passing away with each sense object out there. So it's arising dependent on conditions. It's not a separate entity, but rather a dependent and interrelated process. Put another way, it's impermanent and conditioned and only arises in conjunction with a working organ, for example, the ear, and a sense object like a sound, and a knowing of that. If any of these are missing, then sense consciousness doesn't occur. There's kind of this illusion that it's continuous because it's all happening so fast and rapidly that it's difficult to see except in a meditative state. The concept of consciousness can sometimes be confusing in Buddhism. There's several definitions, different definitions between Buddhist traditions. And the main confusion is between consciousness as an aggregate and consciousness as kind of unconditioned awareness or pure consciousness. The aggregate called consciousness, it is temporary. It arises with sense impressions. It's conditioned, impermanent, insubstantial. Later schools of Buddhism use the word consciousness to refer to that which is unborn or unconditioned. So it's permanent, always present. We often call it consciousness, but we might also call it awareness, presence, source, essential being, or even spirit. The Buddha referred to this unconditioned consciousness when he said, "Consciousness without feature, without end, luminous all around." Sometimes the practice is focused on bringing attention to the consciousness that's unconditioned and always there. So rather than focusing on objects that are out there, such as the breath or sounds, we're focusing attention towards where we're looking from. And when we do this, we can discover the difference between what we're conscious of and consciousness itself. So consciousness as an aggregate is always conscious of something. It only arises and fades with sense objects. Consciousness as a permanent, always there element is like presence. It's always and already there. Several Buddhist traditions, such as Zen, Yogacara, and I believe all Tibetan traditions, posit 9 levels of consciousness. The 9 levels, the first 6 correspond to the six sense objects and sense organs, including the mind. The 7th consciousness is focused on inner thoughts without any sensory input. It's called mano in Sanskrit. And this level corresponds kind of with this abstract thinking or intuition that can understand and articulate the unseen or spiritual aspects of life. And this is the level that helps us directly know the truth of the Buddha's teachings. The 8th level of consciousness, alaya in Sanskrit, is better known as storehouse consciousness. The storehouse here is where the karmic fruits of our thoughts, words, and deeds are collected. It's the current, you could say, of karmic energy that creates this storehouse consciousness. And for those that believe in rebirth, it's this level of consciousness that carries forward from this lifetime into the next. The 9th consciousness, known often as Buddha nature, is the one that's always permanent, is always present, and is permanent. It's believed to be the purest form of consciousness, untainted by the karmic energy from the previous levels. This Amala consciousness is considered to be the source of one's innate potential for awakening. In Buddhism, the aspiration for enlightenment is not seen as a distant goal, but as a possibility that is available in the present moment. The phrase Buddha nature refers to the idea that all human beings have the potential to become a Buddha, to attain full enlightenment. The potential is seen as inherent in every human being and is an unchanging, eternal aspect of one's being. The term luminous mind is often used to describe Buddha nature. This refers to the natural and true state of the mind, which is believed to be inherently present in every person. The luminous mind is seen as being beyond the limitations of the ego and the delusions of the egoic mind. It's believed to be the source of true wisdom and compassion. The Buddha taught us that we cannot find a self in any of the 5 aggregates. Identification with the consciousness aggregate is often the last to fall away. We may realize that we're not the body, feelings, perceptions, or mental formations, but we hang on to the sense that our true nature is that which is aware of these objects. A common meditation practice is to rest as awareness and thereby develop a sense of the witness or the observer of experience. You've probably heard me instruct in this way. The instruction is to watch thoughts arise and pass like clouds in the sky. This is a common example that's used. This enables us to step back from identification with the objects, such as body, thoughts, or feelings. In other words, the egoic self. And when we step back and observe what's happening, we're less likely to get all wrapped up in the ego's drama. When the self identifies with the ego, there's a belief that it is separate from others and the world, and that it can control what happens to it and around it. When we identify with the egoic self, we believe we are what we think, and we believe we are what we feel, and then the ego projects this onto the world. People are what I think they are, the world is what I think it is, what should happen is what should happen, In other words, we struggle with reality. When we practice resting as awareness, we're being taught to relinquish our identification with the ego and instead to engage the witness. When there's a shift of identity from the ego to the witness, it's extremely freeing and can feel like waking up from a dream. But it's not the end of the story. It's not enlightenment. First, we awaken from the ego to the witness. And this is a profound and liberating sense of self. It's the experience of no ego. Identification with the witness is actually the highest form of self-identification. And it can actually feel like you're experiencing oneness or unity. I am all that exists. Because the witnessing self doesn't feel separate. It's often mistaken for no self or the falling away of self. There's a deep sense that I am awareness. I'm not all the things that I'm aware of. It's a higher level duality. Later, we awaken beyond the witnessing self to no self. When one moves into no self, the distinction between the witness and what is being witnessed falls away. I hope you found this talk on sense consciousness as the fifth aggregate to be helpful in providing an understanding of what it is, and also to give you some practices perhaps to engage in that allows you to directly see the true nature of this aggregate called sense consciousness. Thank you, and see you soon.